When I was a kid, I spent a lot of time over at my grandparents' house. Both my parents were forced to travel often for their jobs, so I was dropped off at my grandparents' house pretty often. It wasn't as bad as some kids would expect. These were the days of dial-up internet, so being upset about not having Wi-Fi was non-existent. Kids like myself played outside during those times. Shocking, I know. This particular story takes place when I was about 9 years old. It was right around Christmas time, and they hadn't allowed me to open one present early without my parents knowing. Of course, I remember what it was and how I felt as well. It was a brand new pair of binoculars. I was a big fan of bird watching as a kid and still am today, but of course, I had more time back then. My granddad looked at me and said, "I'm gonna let you go out into the woods to look for all the critters, but be sure not to go past the creek." Being 9 and this kind of thing going in one ear and out the other, I agreed and headed out. The forest behind my granddad's house was massive, and he owned it all. I think my dad told me at one point that it was 9 or so acres. I, as a kid, told myself that I had explored it all. Funny how your imagination can run wild like that. Well, this day in particular, my mind wasn't running rampant. What I saw was real, and I knew it, judging by my grandparents' reaction. I'd been in the forest for a good 10 minutes at this point, just walking as straight as I could, looking for any of the critters that ran around out there. I saw a handful of cardinals and chickadees, but nothing super spectacular. Then, I ran across the creek. It was completely frozen over, of course, but my mind still wondered about trying to think of what could be on the other side. Why wasn't I allowed over there? Of course, it was for safety reasons. Once you're past the creek a little ways, the house is no longer within seeing or shouting distance. In my mind, however, it was the only place I'd see what I wanted to. I wanted to see a bird I hadn't seen, the less common ones. I looked back at the house a few times, contemplating my decision, and had decided not to go over the threshold and disobey my granddad. But then I heard something on the other side. It was a man's voice. It wasn't scary. I remember, it was warm and inviting, kind of like a good audiobook. It grabbed my attention, and before I knew it, I jumped the creek and headed deeper into the woods. I didn't hear that voice again for quite some time, and I wasn't seeing any new birds, so I was beginning to think this was a waste of time. I decided to take one more look into the binoculars and do a quick 360 and then head back. The sun was starting to go down, and I knew if I was out here much longer, I'd get into trouble. I pulled the binoculars to my eyes and took one last look, and I saw it. It wasn't what I was looking for. It was a man. He was tall and wore a fine black suit. He even had a briefcase with him. Judging by how strong the binoculars were, he could have been a little less than half a mile away. He wasn't doing anything. He was just standing there. The longer I looked, the more apparent of how wrong this was came over me. Why would someone in a suit carrying a briefcase be hanging out in the woods in the middle of December? I was so focused I didn't hear my granddad approaching. Soon, he snatched me up and carried me all the way back to his house, scolding me the entire way. I sat on the couch, and he questioned me about what I could have seen that made me disobey him. Through my sniffling and eye rubbing, I could only say, I heard a man out there. His demeanor changed completely, and I remember hearing my grandpa gasp a little bit. He crouched down beside me and said, "What did he say?" He just said hey, and then he was gone. I didn't see him until I crossed the creek. Nearly whispering, he responded, "What did he look like?" He had a suit and a briefcase. I couldn't tell my mom. He looked up at my grandmother and then back at me. No, we're not mad, kiddo. Don't worry. We're not mad. We were just worried about you. It wasn't until I was much older that I figured out what I saw in those woods. I was 18, and my granddad was in bad health. He wasn't at the past anytime soon, mind you, but he was just very sick. We were visiting in the hospital, and when my parents left to get some food, he told me all about what that man was. Apparently, there used to be a cemetery on that land before it became overgrown with trees and vines. That man was a spirit everyone referred to as the Undertaker. According to my granddad, he was a businessman, hence the briefcase, but suffered a heart attack during his wife's funeral. Nowadays, he roams the woods looking for the grave of his wife. It was a heartbreaking tale. The reason he was so worried about me at the time is because if you're caught by the Undertaker, he will curse you. You'll fall gravely ill and eventually pass away from cardiac arrest like him. I'm not sure how much I believe that story, but I will say that I'm glad he never looked at me. His back was facing me the entire time. My grandma did eventually pass away, not from cardiac arrest, if you're curious, but I've kept the legend strong. I tell everyone I know about it, and if I ever run across kids in that area while visiting the old house, I make sure to tell them, never go past the creek.